books, as the title essay suggests, is for people who love books enough to get really up close and physical with them. And some of this is personal essays. So some of it has to do with growing up in a bookish house in Calcutta, which was a bookish city, and to this day remains a city that thinks of itself as the city of the written word. It started with an actual memory, which was every time I thought of Calcutta, I thought of the Howrah Bridge and I thought of the railway station and coming in. And then I would see the walls with letters on them in Bengali graffiti usually, but sometimes English. And it struck me years later that one of the reasons why I felt comfortable in Calcutta as a small child, at that point you're at eye level with what's happening on the walls, is that it feels like living inside a book. So when you were driving through the city, you felt a little bit as though you were literally walking through a large city-shaped book. It's not nostalgic in the sense that I think there's a tendency to romanticize book reading too much. You think of the lonely reader sitting in a tree, detached from the world, and you forget what books are really about. In the years when I was writing as a columnist for the Business Standard, several things happened. One of them was very sad, which was the direction that the country is going in terms of censorship, in terms of authors and other figures from the cultural world finding themselves threatened and attacked. And suddenly, as somebody on what was supposed to be a very quiet beat, the books beat, you find yourself dealing with legal experts and court cases and sadder things. The shooting of M.M. Kalburgi, the ransacking of libraries. There's been a long continuous thread, authors being sent into exile, authors not being allowed to speak on occasion. And but the other part to that was also the surprisingly happy and for me very slow discovery of something that we were not taught back in school and college. Our school and college curriculum in those days was focused on Dryden and Shakespeare and Joseph Conrad. And India came about pretty much when we were written about at a glance, So we'd exist somewhere off to a side. Maybe there'd be a Kipling story, maybe there'd be something of that nature. But you always saw yourself glancingly. And even at the MA level, it took actually getting to the MA level to start discovering a little bit of your history. As a column writer, I started to read about people like Deen Muhammad. And what was fascinating to me was he'd written a really, honestly, a fairly bland and boring explanatory book about India. But what was fascinating to me was the trajectory of his life. He'd gone to England, he'd opened a coffee house, that failed, and then he became a highly successful proprietor of what would be something like a modern spa in Bath, And I liked that. I liked the fact that the first writer of a novel in English was actually a working person. He was not somebody who just sat there on a chaise lounge and wrote books from time to time. And when I began to look at the period, I think I realized that it was as lively as our own. The regional press, not the regional press, but let's put it this way, presses in all Indian languages, including English, were flourishing at that point of time. So you had this rich publishing scenario at a time when a lot of people were bilingual or even trilingual. So if you're reading something like Mukherjee's magazine, which was this periodical done by Shambhu Charan Mukherjee, who was known for being a very good editor with a small addiction to opium, which explains the large gaps between the times that the issues come up. And you're reading about that and you realize he's coming out at the same time as the Bengali presses are coming up with their version of nationalism and they're talking to the Marathi presses. So suddenly this conversation about the Indian nation and who we are is happening in a multiplicity of languages across India. And English is significant only because it's the newest of the Indian languages, but it's the one in which we can talk back, It's the one in which we can address the English and Macaulay and company directly and say, this is what we're about. So some of the essays are about that, and some of them I kept very few of the book reviews in, actually, because any journalism that's written for the moment and for the time probably isn't worth salvaging. But we did keep in a section of brief interviews that I'd done, and again, the interviews are what I think of as snapshot interviews. You're meeting an author at a particular point of time in his or her life, and what you're taking is a small picture of where they are in their journey. When we look back at it though, it was filled with surprising interest, Early Vikram Seth, Arundhati Roy, in between The God of Small Things and a few of her non-fiction writings. There were a lot of authors whom I'm very fond of personally. Alan Seeley, who's gone off to Dehradun. The poets, Jeet Thail, Nissim Ezekiel, whom I didn't actually get to meet, but I write about him. Kamla Das, all of that. So, to an extent, I think this is a book lover's history. And it's written by a book lover for other book lovers, not against the world where television and the internet rules, but understanding that somehow, by some happy miracle, books survive, I don't expect other people to feel as passionate about them as I do. I grew up in a time when books were your television set. Books were also your aeroplane because foreign travel didn't happen that much in that India. So books were how you traveled to Soviet Russia, for example, Russia loomed, I think, almost as large in our minds as probably larger than America at that time, and as large as England. It supplanted England to some extent. But books were also how you figured out who you were as a reader and as a person. And I just hope that other book lovers will like it too. It's fully explained in the book itself, but there's a name for this condition. It's called bibliophagy. There apparently is a whole bunch of people who do eat books. Maybe not an entire book. I wouldn't advise that. But as a child, one of the ways in which I recognized that I liked something when I was very small was to tear off a little bit from the corner or tear off a small passage out there and to eat it. And I've always thought that this is one reason why foreign books had such a lure, because they were printed on superior paper to what we could get at that time in India, so they just tasted better. By and large, my rules for this are hardbacks taste better than paperback. Poetry almost always tastes good. Be careful with bestsellers because you never know where they've been. And don't eat too much at one time because the printed word can be very hard to digest. I think a review is more like a notice that you're writing for the benefit of a reader. A review can be an essay, particularly if it's looking at the period as well, or if it's looking at multiple books in the same school or same genre. But an essay about books gives you much more room to look at all of the other things that were happening. A review is frequently too much about the book itself, and if you're writing a short review, a lot of these reviews were just 600 words. A blurb is 300 words, to put that into perspective. An essay about books can go pretty much in any direction that you want. You can start with looking at Soviet books, for example, and ending up with memories of Sanjay Gandhi and what Delhi was like in those times. You can start with a book about trying to write in a house in Goa. That goes back and forth between the books you've read and the people you've met. One of my favorites in the book is actually about somebody I knew who was a very fine journalist and who was an excellent collector of books. And he always felt that he was the one who introduced me to Delhi's pavement booksellers. And he struggled a great deal with mental issues. He was often depressed. He often found the world hard to handle. And books were his lifeline for the longest time. I really think that reading saved his life until it didn't. And you come across these stories everywhere. At some point you start writing about a book and you realize the most obvious is that you'll end up writing about your childhood. But if you're lucky, you might also end up writing about cities, and particularly vanished cities. When I was writing about Delhi and Calcutta, I wrote with a peculiar kind of freedom. One city has just changed beyond all recognition. One city has not changed at all. And in a sense, that frees you up, because in one case you're writing about something that has gone completely. In one case you're writing about a corner of something, because my Calcutta is very much a child's Calcutta, and it's a tiny sliver of a huge cosmopolitan city. But that city still survives miraculously despite the passage of time for very sad reasons, perhaps because Calcutta hasn't actually progressed that much until recently. But some of it is also about a few of the people. I didn't include too many of these because these could have been portraits that could have filled up another book. But of the people you meet in the trade, you meet the booksellers or you meet publishers like the late Ravi Dayal, or book critics, Meenakshi Mukherjee, bookshop owners like K.D. Singh. And somewhere there needs to be a place where you can set those down as well. When I was going over the history of 18th and 19th century writers, I realized that I actually have three heritages in India. One I've started to claim again as an adult after losing it a little bit in adolescence, which is the Bengali side of me. Increasingly I'll finish a day of working in English and I'll step into Bengali and read, the same way that you finish working and you step into something more comfortable. So Bengali provides that kind of comfortable. There's an immediate sense of coming home when you're reading in your own language. And English, which I always thought of as an alien tongue. English was the language in which Winnie the Pooh books arrived from a generous friend in America. Or it was the language into which the Soviet books were translated, so a double translation out there. Or Eden Brighton wrote about things that you knew you would never access, but somehow, as a child you jumped those bridges. English was supposed to be the language out there, not ours. And suddenly you look at it and you realize every single debate we've had and we continue to have is English drowning out the other bhashas, who do you write for, where do your loyalties lie. That's been had. It's been going on for 200 years or more, and so you're stepping into those currents when you have those debates now. It gave me a history, by the standards of Indian languages, that's a really tiny history. You're talking about just 200 years in a country where some of your oldest languages go back for thousands and thousands of years. But it's nice to have that all the same. Third part of my heritage, I don't know. My father is Uriya, and I'm only just now starting to learn the Uriya alphabet. And it's a very humbling experience, when you can read swiftly in two languages and slowly but well in a third, Hindi. Then to actually have to learn like a child again, I think everyone should do it. It's very good for your ego, cuts you down to size. There are a few that, for example, there's a review of H. Hatter. There's a point at which I look a little closely at Rohinton Mysteries novels. But if you're looking for books that are written in that way, HarperCollins had pulled out a collection of 50 writers on 50 books, which I really recommend. That's beautiful, and those books have their place. This one is, I think it's broader in a way because it reflects the way that we read. Everyone thinks that they're going to read according to a plan, right? People who are career-minded think that they're going to spend their lives reading business books and technological books, and then they suddenly get hijacked sideways by Chetan Bhagat or Durjoy Datta or Devdutt Patnaik, and they find themselves going off into something they'd never planned. And even general, people who read from childhood and read a lot of fiction and poetry. It's very recently I started writing a column on translations for the Business Standard. And it's only when you start doing something like that that you realize how much in your own country there are so many languages that you haven't even walked into, or that you know only a few books, a few authors from. So I like to think that the book reflects the way we are as readers and as people. We move from one thing to the other, we stumble accidentally across our own histories and we say, oh, this is precious. The one question it doesn't answer, but I think it does in a way, is why you would read at all. And the answer is never because you want to go inwards. The solitude of the book reader, it doesn't exist. You're never alone with a book. You're always stepping into something, and sometimes the currents of that are very disturbing. Sometimes it's just mysterious and it's just challenging. And there's a small part of the book that happened accidentally as I was compiling the essays, which is about moving from being a reader of books to being a writer of books, which again was not something that I expected would happen. But it was an interesting passage, and that road was paved by a ton of books, authors, friendly publishers, mentors, A reader's life, one thing I can guarantee you about it, you are never ever alone. I think it ends with the writer's perspective, but 90% of it is from the reader's perspective, because even as a writer, if I'm honest with myself, I think that's what I've been all my life. I wish they allowed this, reader is something attached to a university position, so you can't use it. But every time I'm introduced as a critic and columnist, part of me thinks, well, that's not really it. Because what I do for a living is I read books, and I feel incredibly lucky to have had a job that lets me do that. And sometimes I write them too. But in all honesty, the card should say Nilanjana is a reader of books, former eater of books.